Dawntrail, the newest expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, is so close. At the time of this video going up, Dawntrail is only a week away. But before we go forward, let's take a look back. Hi there, I'm Skia, and I've been playing this game for a long time, but I'm still fairly casual in terms of the content I enjoy, which is to say, dungeons. I love them. So today, I'm going to show you the ranking I've developed for all 13 dungeons in Endwalker. But what system would I use to put them into a ranked order? Well, I'm glad I asked. For months now, I've been pecking away at a spreadsheet making tweaks and adjustments, but here's what I landed on. Each of the 13 dungeons will be scored 1 through 10 in 7 categories. Story, which covers why we're there, the impact, and the sort of initial wonder you have when you play through the dungeon for the first time. Setting and visuals, which cover the look and tone of the dungeon and its inhabitants. Music, which covers, well, the music, but it's Soken, so they're all good. But how good are they in relation to each other? Each boss, 1, 2, and 3, gets its own score. And finally, replay value. How does the dungeon feel to get it on roulette when you're playing it time and time and time again? Once we have those 7 scores, they are all averaged, and that gives us a final score. Without further ado, let's queue up and jump in. Coming in at the bottom of the list is the Fell Court of Troya. Troya does have some good parts in its favor where it scored well. 5 for story, which is the most common score in this category. Troya is a setup dungeon, and what happens here in Troya gets better right after you complete the dungeon, but I wasn't super invested in the 13th shard when I first played this one. Troya's top scores, however, come from the visuals, which I mean, look at it. Creepy castle house in the void? It's rad! For visuals, Troya got a 7. Troya also gets a 7 for boss number 2, Beatrice. She's got a slew of mechanics that keep you on your toes, which is great to see in a dungeon boss. Tanks have to consider positioning, healers have Doom to worry about if people do get hit, DPS have to get in hits and position through big sectioned AoEs and gaze circles. It's fantastic. Where Troya really falls short, and where it got the part of its score that puts it at the bottom of this list, is boss number 1, the Evil Dreamers. I keep hoping for the dev team to nail a non-trash fight versus multiple enemies, but this boss ain't it. They start too far apart, they take a while to aggro, as tank you've got to chase them down, and ultimately it takes too long for it to reach the final phase. There's a lot of mandatory waiting times on this one while you wait for laser beams and other AoEs. So this boss gets a score of 1. And this 1 factors into the dungeon's replayability. When it was part of the EX roulette, it was the one I dreaded getting, and now that it's just part of the 90 rue, it's still pretty low on my desire. All in all, Troya gets an average score of 4.71, putting it in 13th place, fitting for a dungeon in the void. For number 12, we go to Vanaspati, which is not a bad dungeon at all. Its ranking on this list primarily stems from each of its segments just being average. Vanaspati's highest points come from its story, music, and boss number 2, each with a score of 6. In terms of story, the leveling dungeons tend to score higher in this category since they're a part of the bigger overall narrative the expansion is telling, and Vanaspati is no different. Coming hot off the outbreak of the final days, this dungeon shows this area at its worst. It's also got some great in-dungeon story beats that help it out. For example, the group of Matanga that transform in despair, the mother first and then her children, are running from their father, who is also transformed and is boss number 2. And boss number 2 is also doing some interesting things. It's got a bit of jank, especially if you get greedy or have higher ping, like say for example you play on an EU server but you're in Canada. But all in all, it does a good job of teaching you the mechanics and then making you use that knowledge well. Vanaspati's lower scores come from boss 1 and boss 3, since they're a bit lackluster, and from replay. Replay often comes down to the crapshoot of who you're paired up with. It's an 85 dungeon, which is when a lot of the gear from previous expansions starts to wear off being useful. And if you don't have the tops from the last expansion, it can go south real quick. Undergeared tanks can die in the first trash pull due to enemies hitting way harder than the tanks are prepared for. If you're geared up and know what you're doing, this dungeon is a blast, even if it is number 12 on the list, with a final score of 4.86. Number 11, and we have another MSQ dungeon, this time the Tower of Zot. Much like Vanaspati, it doesn't score low because of any low scores in any one area, but it doesn't excel in any one area either. Story, setting, and music get 6, 5, 5 respectively. For story, it's the first new dungeon of the expansion and you're eager to get into it. Plus, you have the added incentive of a kidnapped group of people who need your help. And while I don't primarily play tanks for nothing, we've got to get in there and help. Being the first dungeon expansion also means it's hit and miss in terms of party composition in roulettes. Like other first dungeons of the expansion, Zot can be punishing in both trashful and bosses. The rush between boss 1 and boss 2 can cause wipes if the healer and tank aren't in sync or if the tank isn't something like a warrior. And boss 3, which gets Zot's highest score with 7, is a fireworks display of mechanics. It can be overwhelming, especially if you're returning the game after a long hiatus, but it's a level of frantic fun that I really enjoy. I liked seeing the Magus Sisters as the boss theme in the dungeon, and was delighted that boss 3 was all 3 of them and not just the last one. And they have a kill order. If you don't take out Cinderuva first, she can revive her fallen sisters. The Tower of Zot ends with a final score of 5 as we move into the top 10. The score for 9 and 10 were the same in the end, so the exact order came down to preference. With that, number 10 is the capstone dungeon of the Endwalker story, The Dead Ends. The high scores for The Dead Ends is front-loaded on the story and the setting, with it actually having the highest story score of any dungeon in Endwalker. It's a beautiful retelling of past civilizations, showing what made our little bird friend so sad. It's an extension of Ultima Thule that came before it. You get to see Meteion going from blue at the start of the dungeon to black at the end as he falls deeper into despair and nihilism. However, like most expansion capstone dungeons, replay is a slog. I think only Stormblood so far, with Alamigo, has made a capstone dungeon that is great the first time and continues to be great on repeat plays. Dead Ends hits on a similar level to Amarat, where it's a beautiful story the first time, but I'm never thrilled to see it pop up in roulettes, even with a Mogtone bonus. And I don't really have a solid reason why. It is the exact same pacing structure of every single dungeon in Endwalker. Trash, trash, boss, trash, trash, boss, trash, trash, boss. But even if you're at max level for this one, it feels slow. And that slowness can be compounded if people just barely meet the eye level requirements to get in. Dead End also scores lower for boss number 1 based on my personal past experiences that I've had while playing this dungeon. In a vacuum, the fight is pretty interesting. It has nice movements and mechanics, uses the buddy stack, and can cause must-heal status conditions. However, these highlights are also the downfall. The movement mechanic with the wind is slow and can hurt you if you get a weird lag spike. The buddy stack seems to repel certain players who do not want to be your buddy, and if a healer or bard isn't watching for the debuff, you're going to be down for the count. Dead Ends does pick up in boss 2 and 3, however. Boss 2 mainly gets its score because I mainly play tank, and it's a neat boss to tank. Trying to DPS uptime while dodging AoEs and player overlap can be a bit more frustrating. Boss 3 is overall solid, but I feel it has one or two things too many, so that by the time it gets through everyone once, you don't really get a good chance of seeing what it can do to make things harder with the combined effects before it goes down. It also has a doom effect, but unlike boss number 1 where that was a assumable doom, this one is a heal to full to remove doom, which some players just don't know about, and the game doesn't do a great job of communicating that. All in all, Dead Ends is a beautiful story dungeon that I'm glad to have seen once, happy to see once in a while, but dread getting it in 90 roulettes when there are other options available. Dead Ends finishes at number 10 with a score of 5.14. Also with a score of 5.14, we have Kesis Hyperboria. Another MSQ leveling dungeon. Like Dead Ends, Kesis front-loads its positive points in the story and setting. This is a dungeon that is fantastic to play through for the story, doubly so if you play through with NPC trusts that are only available here. It's the culmination of the Lapis storyline, the breaking point you're looking for. Kesis also scores very high for boss number 3, Hermes. From a storytelling perspective, it's a great combination and pulls elements from Zodiark and Amon. It gets to incorporate the often neglected tank or phys range interrupt silence effect, and rewards proper movement around mechanics. Boss 1 and 2 scored much lower, but they aren't terrible, just plain. In the recorded run that's in the background, our healer DC'd before Boss 1, and we didn't replace them till after Boss 2, which made things a bit more exciting for me on tank, but we still got through it without any issues. That said, there's still more run-of-the-mill bosses that don't really have anything noteworthy about the arena or the mechanics. They're perfectly fine. Kesis scores higher on dead ends mainly on replay, which is ultimately what nudged this one into a better position on the list. At number 8, we go back to our post-story dungeons with the final dungeon of Endwalker, the Lunar Subterrain. This dungeon is rad and has a really neat twist that I didn't see coming when I first played it. Its big downfall is that it's been one of 2 dungeons in the EX Roulette since last October, and well, you haven't seen the other dungeon from the EX Roulette on this list, have you? That said, the Lunar Subterrain overall scored quite highly. It's got the highest story score of any post-launch Endwalker dungeons with 6, and a setting score of 6.2. Now if the whole dungeon was just in the moon caves, it wouldn't have scored so high, but after Boss 1, you get to go back in time and see the downfall of Baron. Outside of NPC allies being clunky to click through when you're in a big fight, this section dungeon rules. It culminates with a boss fight against Durante, who pulls a couple elements from the Golbez trial in a prototype sort of way. However, in order to get to the second section, you need to get past Boss 1, who is, by all comparisons, rather boring. It's an enemy from Final Fantasy IV, which is neat, but the fight itself is dull. And it's mainly due to the boss having just a touch more HP than it needs to have. You really feel this fight dragging on, and then look up and it's still got 15 to 20% HP left, even with the whole party in max gear and playing well. So Boss 1 scores a 2. Boss 2 picks things up by being a more recognizable Final Fantasy IV enemy with some interesting mechanics. You can even avoid the slides with arm's length, which is always neat to see those skills put to use. All in all, Lunar Subterrain ends with a score of 5.29, which is yet another tie, though this is the last of the ties. So also with a score of 5.29, but edging out over Lunar Subterrain, we have Aldols Legacy, the first of the post-expansion dungeons, and this one sees some higher score spikes. Aldols Legacy does not earn these highs from the story or Boss 1, however. The story, post-expansion, is pretty good, but it's more about the characters and not the dungeon-to-dungeon experience. For Aldols, we're on a treasure hunt, and that's neat. Boss 1 is not neat. His main gimmick are these giant swirling AoEs that go off in different directions. For melees and tanks, this is a bunch of downtime and it's more annoying than anything. But once we get past these boss, we travel under the sea to see why this dungeon scored much higher on the setting and visual category. I used to play a lot of Final Fantasy XI, and I played the most during the Treasures of Odd Urgen expansion, and this area is a nice tribute to Nyzel Isle. Plus, it's like being in an aquarium, and that's pretty rad too. Boss 2 and Boss 3 are a nice mix of mechanics too. Boss 2 uses these hand lasers that make positioning important. And Boss 3 makes you spin, spin, spin. The tone of this dungeon is a nice change of pace from the dread that was Endwalker, so it holds a special place in my heart. Plus, it's a quick dungeon, and it's pretty. So all in all, not bad and on replay. And with that, we move on to number 6, the dungeon that has the most feels of them all. The Isoscope. The Isoscope? Isoscope sounds better, so Isoscope is probably correct. Anyway, this is another dungeon that's part of the Endwalker main story, and it comes as things are just ramping up before the final act. We've gone through Lapis to see the past of Ana and Emmet, we've seen the final days erupt across Eorzea. Now what if we took a trip that's more personal to us, the Warrior of Light? I loved the touches throughout this dungeon, seeing the spirits of old friends and allies, and fighting the spirits of enemies long slain. Papalimo, Mombrita, Harshafont, Minfilia, all of them aid our path while
Sloppy!
What's-Her-Face and Cape Wistwind try and stop us. Boss-wise, 1 and 2 were okay. Boss 2 is doing a couple new things, but it's strange that Boss 1 is a reskin of the Weeping City final boss, though she does have a couple moves that are reminiscent of her fight at the end of Castrum. Boss 3 is one of those cathartic fights, where you basically despise someone so much that you chase them into the afterlife to punch their soul one last time. And I'm glad for it, but I never want to see Hermes Fandaniel Amon ever again. The Isoscope scores a bonus on replay as well, since this is an MSQ dungeon that allows for level 90, meaning you get to play with your level 90 toys. All in all, it ends with a score of 5.43. And now we move into the top 5. Have any of your favorites already been mentioned, or are you waiting to see where they end up on my list? The first of the last in the number 5 place is Lapis Manalis. While some of the dungeons lower on the list lost points for being average with 1 or 2 things below, Lapis ends up working the math in its favor by being average with a couple of standout categories it scores big on. Like most of the post-expansion dungeons, it's not winning any category in the story. Another void hole opened up and Vritra is high on copium that his sister is there, or something like that. This dungeon does get some points for diving more into the lore of Reaper, and we see that culminate on boss number 2, scoring a big 8. This fight is a favorite of mine, and unlike the Dark Elf in the Lunar Subterrain, here I'm disappointed when it ends because I'm having fun with it. It's a fun one to play with first-timers as well, to watch as they learn mechanics in real time. Boss 3 is pretty good too, on par with Scarmaglione and Troya. Boss number 1 is neat visually, but the animal charging mechanic has some funky timing and spacing things that I don't always gel with. If you're a melee and get caught on the wrong side, it can be more annoying than punishing. All in all, Lapis ends with a score of 5.57. And while I haven't commented too much on the music, Lapis uses a mix of Garlemald theme which we see in common with our number 4 dungeon, the Tower of Babel. And Babel uses that theme in such a good way. It feels mechanical. There's a section of it that slightly calls back to a song in Alexander. FF14 loves doing this all over the place in general, but having a mechanical tower call back to the mechanical primal is very fitting. Maybe it's just me, but that makes me happy. As for visuals, Babel is certainly interesting. I love the train bit at the start, and then as you climb, it gets more and more gross. It's a Final Fantasy IV reference, and this shows even more in Boss 1 and 2. Boss 1 is fairly simple and plain, but I like reusing the magnetism mechanic. Boss 2 gets a lot of fun toys to play with, and is very unique for a dungeon boss encounter. Plus, as a character, they get to come back in the Manderville story. I really enjoy getting greedy with the drowning frog mechanic, jumping in and out of frog mode to try and get some extra bits of damage in. Boss 3, however, is where this dungeon scores really big, and this one is coming from a biased place of Final Fantasy X is my favorite game of all time. No, I do not want Blitzball in 14. Boss number 3 for Babel is Anima, woven into the 14 story as being made from Xenos' father, a nice parallel to Anima in 10, though this one is less consensual in nature. It brings in some nice fun mechanics as well, that had this been a trial like we had originally thought going in, it would work in a trial version too. Tower of Babel ends with a score of 5.71, and then we go into the top 3. For the top 3, they're all here for a very similar reason. They are quick. When you're doing your level 90 and EX roulettes day after day, you start to appreciate the ones that are quick while still being fun. As such, these 3 could probably go in any order, but after I gave them their scores, here's how they mathed out. At number 3, we have the Stigma Dreamscape. Right out the gate, Stigma scores high in music, because, of course, it's the Primals. The Primals version of a song is always great in a dungeon, and this one is Escape, the Omega song. It's perfect! It also scores high in replay, since it's such a quick run from start to finish, but again that's going to be common for all 3 of the final dungeons. Stigma gets 3rd instead of higher primarily based on the bosses. Boss 1 is neat, another Omega variant, but after the raid version in Stormblood, Dungeon Omega is a bit less interesting. Boss 2 picks things up a touch, but you really feel when your job doesn't have a quick movement option when the boss does a room crossing sweep. Boss 3 pulls in another Omega, a dragon, and big ol' hands. It's a nice thematic finish to the dungeon. The replay and music really carry here, but the rest is pretty good. Stigma finishes with a final score of 5.86. Just a touch higher at number 2, we have the other optional dungeon available at Endwalker's launch, Smileton. Like Stigma, the music and replay really carry here. I'm a sucker for the jazzy remixes like we have in Smileton. I'm also a big fan of the enemy variety we have here in the trash. We have a bunch of old Final Fantasy XI friends, moon cactars, jellyfish. It's great! The setting visuals is incredibly interesting, but ultimately loses points. During the rush between boss 1 and 2, I basically have to look away from the screen because the movements hit me right in the motion sickness. It's a shame, because they look quite cool, they just make me queasy. For bosses, Smileton has a few interesting things going on that are, if nothing else, different than what we normally see in dungeons. I like boss number 1, and it's judging your ability to do mechanics. I like boss number 2, and it's using its buddies to create different AoE patterns. And boss number 3 is fun as well, since you get to see how other people operate. Are they going to stand in AoEs to maintain uptime, or are they going to dodge them? I've had healers charge headfirst into the mines to clear them out of the way, and then Isuna themselves to get rid of the paralysis. It's great! Like Stigma, this dungeon is really quick. I've had it down in under 12 minutes before, and that feels great. It's like getting a new high score. Smileton ends with a final score of 6, which leads us into the final dungeon on the list. The one, of all the Endwalker dungeons, I'm happy to see when it comes up on a roulette. The one I love to run. The Aether Font. Now this one does get bonus points in the replay category by being in the EX room for so long. Maybe my view will change after Dawntrail when it inevitably gets lumped into the 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 roulette, but for now, it's fantastic almost all the way through. For its low points, however, the Aetherfront scores lower in story. To be honest, I don't entirely remember why we're here. The music, which is nice but chill and not really fitting for a dungeon, and boss number 3. I think it's the most interesting of the Kraken fights, but we've had a bunch of them across Final Fantasy XIV. 14 loves its Kraken fights, although I don't think we've seen many since Heavensward. Where Aetherfont really shines outside of replay is in its setting and in boss number 2. The setting is an odd one, but I do really dig the bright, sunny outdoors. It reminds me of a nice winter day where it's sunny but not windy, so it's pleasant to be outside. Plus, I mean, have you seen the fluffy little polar bears? They're so cute! For boss number 2, I think this is one of the best designed dungeon boss fights made in a long time. It's active, teaches you about AoE timing, but also teaches you about situations where you can be greedy and take an AoE and eat a Vuln stack. Then, the arena shrinks, but not in a if you fall off you die sort of way, which is perfect for a dungeon fight. I'd like to see them build more on this concept going forward. All in all, Aetherfont ends with a score of 6.86 and my number 1 dungeon in Endwalker. I'm incredibly excited to see what Dawntrail brings us when it arrives next week. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.